The FBI says they were ready within hours. Local authorities say everything was handled properly. Who should we believe? But the timeline tells a different story. Because for 4 days, in a case where every hour matters, the most powerful investigative tools in the country sat unused, and the evidence went somewhere else. On May 4, 2026, during a podcast appearance, Kash Patel, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, made a statement that would quietly shift the way people began looking at the Nancy Guthrie case. It wasn't meant to be a major announcement. The case wasn't even the main topic. But when asked about it, Patel didn't hesitate. He described a situation where the FBI, equipped, prepared, and ready, was not fully deployed for 4 days. Not absent, but not fully engaged. And in an investigation where time is the most valuable asset. That distinction matters. If you're here because you want analysis that goes beyond the surface, beyond the press releases, beyond what gets repeated across platforms without examination, subscribe to Apex Crime Analyst. Because what the FBI Director Kash Patel revealed in this case will leave you with questions like, is there someone powerful influencing the direction of this case? Why would the world's best intelligence agency be kept out from the beginning? Because in missing person cases, there's a rule investigators don't debate. The first 48 hours are critical, not important. Critical. That's when leads are fresh. That's when digital footprints are still active. That's when recovery is most likely. After that window begins to close, everything changes. And in this case, that window didn't just close. It stretched. According to Patel, federal resources weren't just available. They were mobilized. Hundreds of agents ready to move. A fixed-wing aircraft on standby prepared to transport DNA evidence directly to Quantico, access to what he described as the most advanced forensic capabilities in the world. Everything was aligned for immediate action. And yet, that action didn't happen at full scale. Not right away. Instead, the investigation remained primarily under the control of the Pima County Sheriff's Office during those early days. Now, officially, that's not unusual. Local agencies often take the lead. Jurisdiction matters. Procedure exists for a reason. But this wasn't a case where federal involvement was delayed because it wasn't available. It was offered, and according to Patel, it was ready. The sheriff's office has pushed back on that narrative. In their public response, they emphasized that the FBI was notified promptly, that a task force member was present from the beginning, that cooperation occurred without delay. And on paper, those statements can coexist with Patel's, because presence is not the same as deployment, and cooperation is not the same as full utilization. Two narratives, same case, same timeline, but when you place them side by side, there's a gap, and in investigations, gaps matter. Then there's the second decision, the one that has drawn even more attention, the DNA evidence. In cases like this, DNA isn't just a supporting detail. It can be the entire pathway forward, especially when traditional leads are limited. Forensic analysis, particularly genetic genealogy, can become the only viable route to identifying a suspect, which makes one question unavoidable. Where did the evidence go? According to available information, it did not go directly to Quantico, not immediately. Instead, it was sent to a private laboratory in Florida, a facility the department already had an established relationship with. Again, on the surface, that can be explained. Departments rely on familiar systems. Existing partnerships create efficiency. Processes become routine. But this wasn't just any routine scenario, because at the same time that decision was being made, the FBI was offering immediate access to its highest level forensic resources. No delay, no backlog, immediate. So now the timeline carries two critical elements: a 4-day delay before full federal deployment, and a decision to send key evidence away from the most advanced lab that was already on standby. Individually, each of those can be justified, but together, they begin to form something else. A pattern. Time passed, not just days, weeks, before that evidence made its way into the hands of federal analysts for what is now being described as advanced testing. And in forensic investigations, time doesn't just pass, it compounds. Every delay shifts the trajectory. Potential matches get pushed further down the line. Opportunities narrow, momentum fades, and once momentum is lost, there's no guarantee it comes back. So, what are we looking at? A delay in full deployment, a rerouting of critical evidence, and two official explanations that don't quite align in tone, even if they overlap in facts. This is where the case moves beyond simple procedure. Because when multiple decisions consistently result in slower progress, even when faster options are available, investigators begin asking a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but why it happened that way. There is no official claim of interference, no confirmed evidence of obstruction, nothing that definitively points to deliberate control, but the difference between what could have happened and what did happen creates space, and in that space, a possibility begins to form. Quietly, carefully, what if the issue isn't just delay? What if it's influence? Not the kind you can easily prove, not something written in reports or stated in briefings, but the kind that shows up in decisions, subtle ones, choices that seem reasonable on their own, but begin to look different when viewed together. Remember, if you want to be here when the next big news in this case breaks, when that forensic result comes back, when that detail finally surfaces that changes the entire trajectory, subscribe to Apex Crime Analyst. Because if the fastest path wasn't taken, if the most advanced resources weren't immediately used, if critical time was allowed to pass despite available solutions, then the question shifts again. Not, was this a mistake? But who benefits from it? And that's where the discomfort begins. Because in any investigation there are only two directions: toward answers, or away from them. If everything in this case was done according to standard procedure, then the outcome, whatever it becomes, will reflect that. But if even one key decision was influenced by something beyond procedure, something beyond urgency, something beyond solving the case as quickly as possible, then the implications are far more serious. Because that would mean this isn't just a delayed investigation, it's a redirected one. And when a case is redirected, you have to ask the question no one officially asks. Is every effort being made to solve it? Or is something, somewhere, making sure it isn't solved too quickly? That question doesn't come with an easy answer, but it's now part of the case, and it's not going away. The problem with time is that it doesn't just pass, it echoes, and in this case, those early decisions, those first 4 days, don't stay in the past. They follow everything that comes after, every lead that doesn't materialize, every test that takes longer than expected, every moment where investigators are left waiting instead of moving, because in investigations like this, mistakes, if they are mistakes, don't disappear, they compound, and that's what makes this stage of the case so unsettling. Not what we know, but what we can't know anymore. What if there was a witness who remembered something clearly on day 1, but couldn't recall it by day 5? What if there was digital evidence that existed briefly, before being overwritten, deleted, or lost in the normal flow of time? What if there was a trace, so small, so fragile, that it only existed in that narrow window when everything was still fresh? We don't know, and that's the point. Because the most critical losses in an investigation are rarely the ones you can see. They're the ones that leave no record. This is where the narrative begins to shift, from what happened to what might have slipped away, because when people look at this case now, they're not just looking at evidence, they're looking at decisions, and more importantly, patterns. A delay when speed mattered most, a redirection when a faster path was available, a timeline that, even when explained, still feels off. And when patterns start to form, human instinct does something automatic. It looks for intent. Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence that anyone deliberately slowed this investigation. No official statement suggests obstruction. No verified report proves interference. Everything we're seeing can still exist within the boundaries of procedure, but procedure doesn't erase perception. And perception, in cases like this, becomes part of the story, because from the outside looking in, a different kind of question begins to take shape. What if this wasn't about what went wrong, but about what was allowed to go wrong? Not forced, not ordered, but permitted, and that distinction matters. Because influence, real influence, rarely looks obvious. It doesn't need to. It can exist in hesitation, in choices that lean one direction instead of another, in decisions that are technically valid, but not optimal. And when those decisions consistently result in slower progress, people start asking something deeper. Not just, why did this happen? But, would it have happened this way in every case? Or was there something about this case that changed how it was handled? That's where the idea of power quietly enters the conversation, not as an accusation, but as a possibility, because power, in its most subtle form, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to control everything. It only needs to influence enough. Enough to delay, enough to redirect, enough to make sure that momentum never fully builds. And here's the part that makes this idea so difficult to confront. If influence like that existed, it wouldn't leave fingerprints. There would be no single moment you could point to and say, that's it. That's where it happened. Instead, it would look exactly like what we're seeing now. A series of decisions, each individually explainable, but collectively harder to ignore, because when every critical moment seems to result in lost time, missed opportunity, or delayed progress, the pattern starts to feel less random, and that leads to the question that lingers beneath everything. Is this case unfolding the way it naturally would, or the way it's being allowed to? That question doesn't accuse anyone. It doesn't name a suspect. It doesn't claim wrongdoing, but it does something just as powerful. It reframes the entire investigation, because if the system worked exactly as intended, then these outcomes are just unfortunate. But if even one decision, at one critical moment, was influenced by something outside the normal goal of solving the case as quickly as possible, then everything that follows carries a different weight. And that weight is what people are beginning to feel. Not certainty, not proof, but pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when a case doesn't move the way it should, when answers take longer than expected, when timelines stretch beyond what feels reasonable, and when that pressure builds long enough, it turns into something else. Doubt. Not just about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but about whether the path to finding out has been as direct as it could have been, because at the center of all of this, past the timelines, past the statements, past the decisions, there's a single question that refuses to go away. If everything possible was done, why does it feel like something was held back? And until that question is answered, this case won't just be about what happened, it will be about what might have been prevented from happening, and whether somewhere, behind the structure of procedure and protocol, there exists a level of influence, quiet, unseen, and powerful enough to shape the direction of an investigation, without ever having to be seen doing it. Now let's examine the effort involved in this case. When you examine the effort involved in this case, the method becomes significant. Taking an 84-year-old woman from her home is not complicated from a physical standpoint. It's tragic, but logistically straightforward. If the objective had been simply to eliminate Nancy Guthrie, there are far more efficient methods. Direct, quick, low risk. But this wasn't that. This was elaborate, time-consuming, high risk. It involved staging a kidnapping, managing a disappearance, creating ransom notes, establishing a Bitcoin wallet, maintaining some level of control or concealment for an extended period. That level of complexity suggests the method itself had to mean something. The process was part of the message. There's a psychological profile that fits this pattern. Someone who becomes fixated on a public figure. Not always violently at first, not always with clear intent, but obsessively. They follow the person's career. They consume media about them. They build a relationship in their mind, that doesn't exist in reality. And sometimes, something shifts. A perceived slight, a comment that feels personal, a belief that they've been wronged, or ignored, or disrespected. That fixation turns into grievance. In cases involving media personalities, this pattern isn't uncommon. The obsessive research, the deep familiarity with the target's life and family, the sense of entitlement to their attention or acknowledgement. And when that entitlement is frustrated, it can turn into something darker. If Nancy Guthrie was taken not for ransom, but as a way to hurt Savannah, to send Savannah a message, then the public nature of the ransom notes makes perfect sense. Because the goal wasn't to quietly extract money. It was to make sure Savannah knew, to make sure the media knew, to make sure the message was received. And if that's the framework, then the ransom itself was never meant to succeed. It was theater, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Which means the investigation isn't looking for someone who wanted money. It's looking for someone who wanted to hurt. Someone with a grudge. Someone who felt justified in taking an 84-year-old woman to make a point. The recommendation from criminal profiler Jim Fitzgerald has been specific. Go back through Savannah Guthrie's correspondence. 10 years of emails, security team records, any communication that suggested fixation, obsession, or inappropriate focus. Because if the motive involves Savannah, then the suspect pool isn't general criminal networks. It's people who knew who Nancy was because they were paying attention to Savannah. And in that data, somewhere in those messages, those interactions, there may be a name. The contradictions don't resolve easily. The ransom notes were articulate and methodical. The doorbell footage shows someone fumbling with shrubbery, apparently caught off guard by a camera that should have been anticipated. The preparation was sophisticated. Disguise, tools, timing. The execution appeared amateurish. Improvised camera response. No operational discipline. This has led investigators to consider two possibilities. 1. A single perpetrator with uneven capabilities. Someone who could plan effectively while sober, but operated sloppily under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Retired FBI agents who've reviewed the footage have noted the suspect's behavior appeared consistent with impairment, movement that suggested chemical influence, decision-making that lacked the sharpness the preparation implied. That theory is plausible. It accounts for the contradictions. It simplifies the suspect pool. And statistically, most crimes are committed by individuals, not groups. But the alternative remains on the table. Multiple actors with divided responsibilities. One person who writes, one person who executes. The sophistication in communication doesn't necessarily translate to sophistication in operational security. Criminal profilers who specialize in abduction cases have used the term puppet master when discussing this scenario. A planner who remains hidden, who directs the operation, who has the motive and intelligence, but who delegates the physical execution to someone else. Someone less sophisticated. Someone who might be hired, coerced, or manipulated into performing the visible role. If that's the case, then the person captured on the doorbell camera isn't the mastermind. They're the tool, and that distinction matters because it changes how the investigation proceeds. There's another element that supports the multiple perpetrator theory. A detail that criminal investigators keep returning to. $1.2 million in reward money has been offered. That's not a symbolic amount. That's life-changing money for most people. And yet, no one has come forward. No informant, no associate, no family member or friend who recognized the figure on the doorbell footage and decided the money was worth more than their loyalty. In cases involving conspiracies, that silence is unusual. Because people talk, relationships deteriorate, financial pressure mounts, someone drinks too much and says something they shouldn't. Someone gets arrested on an unrelated charge and decides cooperation is their best option. But in this case, 79 days in, with over $1 million on the table, nothing. One explanation is that the person on the doorbell camera worked alone, has no associates to inform, and has maintained perfect operational security. That's possible. The other explanation is darker, that the person on the doorbell camera is dead, eliminated by whoever hired them, precisely because they became a liability the moment their face appeared on footage. Because a puppet master who's willing to orchestrate a kidnapping to hurt someone might also be willing to eliminate the one person who could connect them to the crime. If that theory is correct, then the silence isn't evasion, it's elimination. On May 4th, 2026, FBI Director Kash Patel appeared on a podcast. The topic wasn't supposed to be the Nancy Guthrie case specifically, but when asked, Patel began speaking. And what he said introduced a new layer of concern. According to Patel, the FBI was kept out of the investigation for 4 days, not excluded entirely. Patel acknowledged that a task force member was present at the scene, but prevented from deploying the full resources the Bureau was prepared to offer. Patel stated that he had hundreds of agents ready to move to Arizona, that he had a fixed-wing aircraft on standby, prepared to transport DNA evidence to Quantico immediately, that he personally offered to expedite forensic analysis through what he described as the best DNA lab in the world. Instead, the Pima County Sheriff's Office chose to send the evidence to a private laboratory in Florida, a facility they had an existing relationship with, but one that did not have the advanced extraction capabilities that Quantico offers. 4 days. In a missing person case, the first 48 hours are critical. Evidence degrades. Leads go cold. Witnesses forget details. The window for recovering someone alive narrows rapidly. 4 days of delayed federal deployment. 4 days before the FBI's full investigative apparatus was allowed to engage. And weeks, possibly months, before DNA evidence reached the facility that had the best chance of processing it successfully. The Pima County Sheriff's Office responded publicly to Patel's claims. Their statement emphasized that the FBI was notified promptly, that a task force member was present from the beginning, that cooperation occurred without delay. They described the decision to use the Florida lab as operationally appropriate, noted that both laboratories worked in partnership, and framed the processing route as standard procedure. But standard procedure and optimal procedure are not the same thing. At this stage of the investigation, what's confirmed is this: DNA evidence that could have been at Quantico within hours was instead sent to a private lab. It remained there for weeks. It was only recently transferred to the FBI facility for what's being described as advanced testing. And in a case where genetic genealogy may be the only viable pathway to identifying a suspect, every week of delay extends an already months-long process. The question isn't just about jurisdiction, it's about whether investigative ego or territorial instinct compromised the timeline, whether the decision to exclude federal resources early on, whether for 4 days or 4 hours, cost opportunities that can't be recovered. Because if Nancy Guthrie's fate was determined in those first days, then every delay after that wasn't just procedural, it was consequential. Hair evidence comes in 2 forms. There's the follicle, the root, which contains a robust DNA sample, and there's the shaft, the visible strand, which historically has been far more limited in value. If you recover a hair with the follicle attached, DNA extraction is straightforward. The profile is clear, usable, and can be run against criminal databases or used in genetic genealogy with a high probability of success. But if you only recover the shaft, the challenge increases significantly. Older forensic techniques couldn't extract enough usable DNA from hair shafts alone to build a reliable profile. For years, rootless hair was considered circumstantial at best. That has changed. Advances in extraction technology have made it possible to pull usable DNA from the shaft, even without the follicle. It's not guaranteed. Variables like chemical treatment affect the success rate. Hair that's been dyed, bleached, or chemically processed is harder to work with. But it's no longer the dead end it used to be. The hair recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home was rootless. That's confirmed. It was sent first to the Florida lab, where initial processing occurred. Results from that analysis have not been made public. What we know is that the sample was subsequently transferred to Quantico for what's being described as advanced testing. That transfer is significant. It suggests the Florida lab either couldn't extract a usable profile, or the profile they obtained requires more sophisticated analysis than their facility can provide. Quantico specializes in cases exactly like this. Evidence that's challenging, degraded, or requires cutting-edge technology. If the FBI lab can extract a usable profile, the next step is genetic genealogy. This is the process that has revolutionized cold case investigations over the last several years. Instead of relying on a direct match in a criminal database, which only works if the suspect has been arrested and processed before, investigators use public genetic databases to build family trees. They identify relatives, they narrow down branches, they cross-reference geographic location, age, and other identifying factors. And eventually, if the process works, they land on a name. It's not fast. Even under ideal conditions, genetic genealogy can take months. Investigators have to build trees carefully, verify connections, rule out individuals who don't fit the profile, and if the DNA sample is weak, if the extraction was partial, if the database matches are distant relatives rather than close ones, the process becomes even slower. But in a case where traditional investigative leads have been limited, where 30,000 tips haven't produced an arrest, where clear doorbell footage hasn't resulted in positive identification, genetic genealogy may be the pathway that eventually breaks this open. The challenge is patience, because eventually can mean months. And for a family waiting for answers on day 79, months feel impossible. There's a shift that happens in missing person investigations. Not a formal announcement, not a press conference moment, but a change in how resources are allocated, how evidence is prioritized, how communications are framed. It's the shift from rescue to prosecution, from hoping for the best outcome to preparing for the most likely one. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that shift has occurred. When you combine the lack of proof of life, the bad faith negotiation pattern, the extended time frame, and the blood evidence recovered at the scene, the probabilities become harder to ignore. According to those who've worked similar cases, the chances of recovering Nancy Guthrie alive are, in their assessment, infinitely small. That doesn't mean impossible. It doesn't mean the investigation has stopped looking, but it does mean the focus has changed. Every piece of evidence now isn't just about finding Nancy. It's about building a case against whoever took her. It's about ensuring that when a suspect is identified, the evidence is strong enough to hold up in court. It's why the hair sample matters so much. It's why the financial records review continues. It's why investigators are going back 10 to 15 years through Nancy's contact history, cross-referencing names, checking backgrounds, looking for patterns. Because if Nancy can't be brought home, the next best outcome is justice. And justice requires evidence that doesn't just identify a suspect, but proves what they did beyond reasonable doubt. For Savannah Guthrie, this reality is unimaginable. The public saw her grief in those early weeks, her visible devastation, the way she had to be supported physically when appearing outside the family home. She returned to the Today Show after spending over a month in Tucson, and there have been those who've questioned why she hasn't been more visible in advocating publicly for her mother-in-law, but that expectation may be unrealistic. Savannah is dealing with young children, a marriage, a nationally visible career, and trauma that most people will never experience. The idea that she should perform grief publicly, that she should release weekly statements or maintain a social media presence about her mother's disappearance, ignores the reality that she is a victim in this case too. And there's another element that's worth considering. If the motive for this crime was revenge against Savannah, if Nancy was taken specifically to hurt her, then continued public visibility may have been exactly what the perpetrator wanted. Silence, in that context, might be the most appropriate response. What's harder to understand is the relative absence of Nancy's daughter, Annie, and son-in-law, Tommaso Sion. They live in the Tucson area. They were part of Nancy's immediate circle. And yet, there have been no public statements, no organized community vigils, no visible advocacy. That absence has fueled speculation, some of it unfair, some of it inevitable. In high-profile cases, silence gets interpreted. Family members who don't perform grief in expected ways become subjects of suspicion, regardless of whether there's any investigative basis for it. The Pima County Sheriff has stated publicly that the family has been cleared. There are no charges, no official statements of suspicion directed at any family member, but the scrutiny remains, particularly around Tommaso, whose physical appearance has been compared to the doorbell footage: stocky build, facial hair, general profile. That comparison has been noted, it's been discussed, but noting resemblance and establishing involvement are entirely different standards. And at this stage, there's no public evidence connecting Tommaso or any other family member to the crime. What there is instead is a family in limbo, unable to grieve fully because there's no confirmation, unable to hope freely because the probabilities are against them, and navigating a public spotlight that demands performance of emotion in ways that may not align with how human beings actually process trauma. This case isn't solved. It's ongoing, which means every question we've examined is still open. Every theory is still just that, a theory. Every piece of evidence is still being processed. But what the investigation has revealed, even without resolution, is structure, not chaos, but design, not randomness, but intent. The ransom notes weren't a desperate attempt at negotiation. They were performance. The public communication wasn't a mistake. It was strategy. The silence following the February 10th Bitcoin deposit wasn't a breakdown. It was confirmation. And somewhere in the 10 to 15-year history of Nancy Guthrie's life, there's a person who knew her, who had access, who believed they had a reason to do this, who thought they were smart enough to get away with it. The investigation believes that person made mistakes, that overconfidence created vulnerabilities. That evidence exists, even if it hasn't been fully identified yet. The hope, the only hope at this point, is that the hair sample produces a profile, that genetic genealogy builds a family tree, that a name emerges. Because without that, Nancy Guthrie remains missing, her family remains in limbo, and whoever did this remains free. There are families across this country waiting for answers in cases that have gone years without resolution. The difference here is that this case is still active, the task force is still working, tips are still being processed. The forensic pathway is still viable, but viable doesn't mean fast, and active doesn't mean imminent. What we're looking at is an investigation operating on a timeline that doesn't align with the urgency a family feels, or the attention span the public has, or the expectations that develop when there's clear footage of a suspect. If you want to be here when something breaks, when that forensic result comes back, when that detail finally surfaces that changes the entire trajectory, subscribe to Apex Crime Analyst. Because this isn't a case we're covering, it's a case we're investigating, and when movement happens, the analysis starts here. Until then, the question remains, if the ransom was never real, if this was always about revenge or a message or something else entirely, then what happens now? Does the perpetrator just disappear? Do they feel satisfied that the message was sent? Or is there more to come? Day 79. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The investigation continues, and the silence from that Bitcoin wallet might not mean the end. It might just mean a shift, a new phase, something we haven't seen yet. This is Apex Crime Analyst, where we don't just report what happened, we investigate what it means. And we'll be here when the next development surfaces. Because in cases like this, resolution doesn't come from headlines. It comes from evidence, and the evidence is still being built.